We, the generations of revolutionaries today, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And it's imperative for us that we learn from their life and experience. And one of them is Rosa Luxemburg. She's a figure that has been hijacked by the soft leftists, if you can call them that. People who try to use her to justify their own left reformism and putting it in a radical veneer. And I think it's time that we set the record straight and that we, the IMT, reclaim Rosa Luxemburg as the revolutionary that she was. I will focus on two myths that has been created around her. But first, a little bit of background. She was born in 1871 in the Russian-occupied Poland. She was a Pole, not allowed to speak her own language in school. She was a Jew and she was a woman. She started fighting oppression in a very young age. Already in high school, she became politically and revolutionary active. And before she turned 20, she had to flee the country and move to Switzerland. In 1898, she decided to move to Berlin. She decided to move there in order to participate in what was probably the strongest labor movement in the world at that time, the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD. The leadership there, they found her a bit difficult to handle. So they tried to derail her into the women's movement of the SPD. But she wasn't a person that was easily derailed. And she threw herself into the most important debates of the movement at that time. When she arrived in Berlin, it was just in time for the essential debate about reform and revolution that Edward Bernstein had raised inside the SPD. Bernstein tried to introduce a revision of Marxism and actually transforming the political foundation of the SPD from Marxism into reformism. And Rosa Luxemburg, she threw herself into this, also explaining it wasn't just a theoretical question. It was a question of the life or death of the SPD. I think if you read her text, Social Reform and Revolution Today, you will find it striking that it is in many ways the exact same arguments that you can hear on the left wing today. And you can take quotes from her and use directly against a lot of these soft leftists in the labor movement that we meet today all over the world, I think. And throughout her life, she played a key role in fighting the opportunist, reformist degeneration that happened in the German social democracy and in the Second International. A fight that ended up in her being the key part of founding the German Communist Party, and also a fight that ended in her being killed for fighting for what she believed in. She has become somewhat of a left-wing icon, but I would say that her legacy has been grossly distorted. This concept of so-called Luxemburgism has been invented. They present her as presenting some kind of a special trend within Marxism, as her being both opposed to the reformists, but also the Leninists and the Bolshevism, like some kind of third way, a softer revolutionary way, more democratic way, in their view. In reality, they try to use her to cover up for their own left reformism in radical clothing. They try to portray her as some champion of working class creativity and spontaneity, and as being in opposition to some ultra-centralist, undemocratic Lenin, who supposedly made a coup in Russia to set up a dictatorship under his own leadership. This is false, and I will try to explain this. But this Luxemburgism, so-called, it can seem attractive to young, honest revolutionaries, revolutionaries who seek an alternative to what they have been told is Leninism, but is in actual fact Stalinism. But this idea of a special Luxemburgism as an independent trend in opposition to Leninism and Bolshevism is false to the core. It is based on myths that is created by taking texts and quotes out of context, and also hiding the fact that Luxemburg on several occasions changed her mind when events convinced her that her criticism of Lenin and the Bolsheviks had been wrong. If you make a serious study of the writings and life of Rosa Luxemburg, you can reach no other conclusion that she was a revolutionary, a communist, and on the same side of the barricade as Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the same side of the barricade that the IMT stands on. There are many myths that has been created. I want to use my talk to try and combat the two myths that I think are most important. The first one is that she supposedly had this special theory of spontaneity and was against the building of a revolutionary organization to lead the working class. And that she somehow predicted how the Russian Revolution would end up, and the practical conclusion being in a dictatorship under Stalin, and the practical conclusion of these Luxemburgists is sorry, is from that therefore we shouldn't build a revolutionary organization at all. And the second myth is that she supposedly was an opponent of the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks. But let's begin with the question of organization and spontaneity. We are told that Luxemburg stood for the spontaneity of the masses and their creativity as against the Leninist model of a highly centralized, monolithic revolutionary party. It is especially her work, the mass strike, the political party, and the trade unions that is used to create this myth. But this claim that this text support this myth, it both misses the point on why she wrote the pamphlet and against whom she was polemicizing. And furthermore, and this is general for all the claims about what Luxemburg stood for, you can only create this myth if you grossly distort the article. You cannot, in honesty, read this article and from that claim that Luxemburg dismisses the concept of revolutionary leadership. The article is analyzing the first Russian Revolution in 1905. It's explaining in great detail how the Russian masses rose spontaneously in mass strikes and also how they set up Soviets. The Soviets is basically workers' councils, a development of the strike committee. It was something that the Russian masses found up as the need arose. It wasn't something that had been described by any Marxist theoretician beforehand. And Luxemburg described this process. And it was these councils that in 1917 became the organs of workers' power and took power in Russia. The article is written for a German audience. It wasn't written into a debate in the Russian party. It was a contribution to a debate taking place inside the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party. And it is basically a very harsh criticism of the leadership of the SPD and their behavior. Around the time of the 1905 revolution in Russia, there was also a strife wave taking place in Germany. And a discussion was taking place inside the SPD on the mass strike. That is what, at least in Denmark, we call the general strike, on how and when to use it and with what methods. In contrast to Russia, in Germany, there were strong trade unions and a strong social democratic party with mass roots in Germany. But the leaders of the German workers' movement, they treated the strikes with contempt and also said that they were immature and that they were doomed to fail. And in contrast, Rosa Luxemburg and the revolutionary wing of the SPD, they welcomed the strikes and argued for the need of the party to intervene and to give the strikes a political leadership and direction. And Luxemburg, she, in her criticism of the leadership of the SPD, she compared them, or she used an example saying that the SPD leadership, they treated the mass movement as a pocket knife, i.e. as something you can just open and close as the party found convenient. You call the masses to the street and you send them home. Instead, she said, using the example of Russia 1905, that the masses move without permission from any party. They move when they move. And she argued that when the masses move, it was the role of the party to give this movement direction and leadership. And in these ideas, she was in complete agreement with Lenin. So this article about the mass strike was written for this debate. As a criticism of the leadership of the German SPD for not understanding how the masses move and not wanting to lead the masses when they moved. It was in actual fact a criticism of the reformist actions of the leadership of the SPD that in some ways anticipated the later actions, I would say, at a time where it wasn't so clear how far the reformism had spread it in the top layer of the SPD. it wasn't a criticism of the Bolsheviks, with whom she was in agreement with in regard to the 1905 revolution. In December 1905, she had gone to Poland to participate in the revolution. At that time, which wasn't obvious at the time, but at that time, the revolution was already at an ebb. And she got arrested in March 1906. A few months later, she got released and went to Finland. In Finland, many of the Bolshevik leaders were also present, and she had long discussions with many of them, including Lenin. And it became clear in these discussions that on the fundamental questions, they agreed. She participated in the Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Party in 1907. And this was a Congress where you could say all the tendencies of the Russian Social Democratic Party participated, the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and also the Polish party that for historical reasons hadn't been part of the Russian Social Democratic Party before. So you had people like Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Plekhanov, discussing the experience of the first and failed Russian Revolution. What was the lessons to be drawn? The revolution had drawn the different trends closer, but now again the differences began to come to the fore, the differences between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks and so on. And this became clear in the discussions during the Congress. Rosa Luxemburg, she held a long speech on behalf of the Polish party. And the main part of the speech she used to heavily criticize the Mensheviks and their conduct and their line during the revolution. She criticized them for giving up the independent struggle of the working class and criticized them for putting their trust in the bourgeoisie and the liberal parties and how can you say that? And subordinating the working class to the bourgeoisie, basically. She was fully on the side of the Bolsheviks and praised them for their independent class policy. And she agreed with them that the next step would have been for the masses to go forward in the Russian revolutions. Russian Revolution of 1905 would have been for an armed uprising of the workers in Russia. So while she criticized the Mensheviks in their basic position, you could say, she had one concrete critical remark about the Bolsheviks. And that was that she thought they had put too much emphasis on organizing the technical side of the armed uprising. She said that the masses themselves, they would take care of this question and solve it during the revolution. And I think this revealed also what I believe is her weak side and something that runs through her entire life, that her approach to organization is a bit abstract. She has this idea that problems of organization will be solved when they arise, basically, which is a consequence of her being in the German SPD that was very organized, and where she could see the bureaucratism putting a brake on the movement of the masses and the workers. But I believe this was a mistake of hers. But I think if you look at these debates, and also if you look at what she writes, it's very clear that when she criticized the Bolsheviks, she didn't reject political leadership, just as Lenin didn't reject the spontaneity of mass struggle. They agreed that the masses move when they move. It's not by order of any party, but when they move, it is necessary that there is revolutionary leadership to this movement. The difference was on how much emphasis revolutionaries should put on the practical side of organizing the masses taking power. And you can see this with the practical consequences. Lenin built the Bolsheviks, and Luxemburg didn't build a party in time that could lead the masses. And I think history has shown Luxemburg to be wrong in relation to Lenin on this question. Connected to this question of organization, these so-called Luxemburgists, they reject the building of a revolutionary party at all. In continuation of them claiming that she was against organization, they presented as her somehow anticipated the development of bureaucratic dictatorship under Stalin, And also they claimed that the Stalinist dictatorship, that it followed naturally from Lenin's ideas on organization, implying you shouldn't build a revolutionary organization because it will always end up in a Stalinist bureaucratic dictatorship. They present the myth that Luxembourg was for some kind of genuine workers' democracy in opposition to the dictatorial methods of Leninism. This idea is wrong on many levels. The bureaucratic Stalinist degeneration of the Russian revolution did not flow from Leninist view of organization from the Bolsheviks. The Stalinist degeneration was a consequence of the objective conditions in Russia in 1917 and the years after. It was the consequence of the revolution taking place in a backward country and the fact that the revolution remained isolated. None of the leaders of the Bolsheviks at that time imagined that the Russian Revolution could lead to socialism in Russia alone. Their idea was to hold on until the workers of the more developed capitalist countries, especially Germany, came to their help. If you look at history and what actually happened in Russia, you can see that the bureaucratic regime was not a continuation of the organizational methods of the Bolsheviks or the Russian Revolution. And it wasn't a consequence of the Russian Revolution, how it took place, or the worker state set up under the leadership of Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. The two regimes were separated by a river of blood. The Stalinist regime practically wiped out the old Bolshevik party. If you take I think many of you will have seen these pictures of all the members of the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks during the revolution, the 1917 revolution, and you look at what happened to these people, you will see that most of them will have disappeared or been killed when we come to 1940. The Luxemburgists falsify what Lenin and the Bolsheviks really stood for in order to facilitate this myth. They portray the Bolshevik party as some kind of monolith without any free debate under a highly centralized regime under Lenin and his dictatorship. But the truth is that the Bolshevik party had the fullest freedom of internal debate. If you read about the congresses, you can see that different opinions was being freely discussed and often in a very tense atmosphere and no words minced. What is it that these soft leftists, these Luxemburgists, really have against the Bolshevik party? It is that it wasn't a debating club. It wasn't a place where ideas could freely be discussed just for the sake of discussion or for individual expression. The Bolshevik party was a fighting revolutionary organization where debates were taken in order to prepare the workers for taking power. It was a fighting organization. Internally, it was organized on the lines of democratic centralism, full democratic debates. But once an internal debate had taken place on a question, a vote would be held and the majority policy would become the policy of the party, and the party members had to follow the line and carry out the decisions. Just like it takes place at a factory or workplace when the workers discuss whether to strike or not. You have a debate, you take a vote, and then you decide whether everybody strikes or not. These Luxemburgists, in order to try and pit Luxembourg against Lenin, and claim that Luxembourg thought he was an undemocratic, ultra-centralist, they use a special article. It's an article from 1904 called The Organizational Questions of the Russian Social Democracy. I think it has been renamed, so I don't remember the exact title, but something like Marxism versus Leninism by someone probably in the 70s. Which says everything, because that is not the original title that Luxemburg gave that article, but it shows how they try to distort it. Here she denounced Lenin and the Bolsheviks for their ultra-centralism, and she even accused them of blankism. Blankism is the idea of organizing a social revolution by a small conspiratorial group of revolutionary leaders, basically a coup. Like Lenin, Luxemburg, she wasn't, how can you say that? Weak in words. When she meant something, she said it very harshly. But also like Lenin, she wasn't afraid of admitting later if she had been wrong in her harsh words. In 1903, in the split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, she initially sided with the Mensheviks. She knew a lot of the Menshevik leaders personally and believed their side of the story of what happened in the 1903 Congress. The reality is that Luxemburg didn't understand what Lenin was striving for in 1904 when she wrote the article. I think the truth is that very few, if any, really did at the time. But if you look at the article, the Luxemburgists, they actually take her argument and turn it on its head. In the article, she doesn't say that the kind of party that Lenin is building will establish a bureaucratic dictatorship after the revolution. It is not, as the Luxemburgists say, a warning against the Stalinist degeneration. What she says is that the party that Lenin is striving to build is in danger of degenerating before the revolution, degenerating into a sect, and therefore risks not being capable of carrying out a revolution. So she's not against a revolutionary organization or revolutionary leadership. She's debating what kind is the best in order to secure the victory of the workers. And furthermore, she changed her mind. And this is never mentioned by the Luxemburgists. They just pick and choose what they want to use from her. In articles and at the Congress in 1907 of the Russian Party, she said that experience of 1905 had shown her to be wrong. She said that her warnings about blankism being inherent in Bolshevism in 1904 belonged to the distant past. That is a quote. And from 1905 and after, she sided with the Bolsheviks on all fundamental questions against the Mensheviks. And later, in 1918, together with Karl Liebknecht, she set out to form the German Communist Party as part of the Communist International, i.e. building a revolutionary party. So to say that she is diametrically opposed to Lenin on this question is sheer dishonesty. There is no fundamental difference between Lenin and Luxemburg in their understanding of the masses and the need for organization. They were just in different roles and different situations. The masses move when they are ready. The outbreak of struggles, mass strikes, revolutions are mainly, or in most examples, spontaneous in nature. But they also agreed on the need for revolutionaries to build a working class party and to politically intervene and lead the masses. You could say the difference was that Lenin understood and carried out the need to build a revolutionary cadre organization. I will get back to that in the end. But before I return to that, I will go into the second myth, the question of the Russian Revolution. The main myth is that Rosa Luxemburg was opposed to Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution in 1905 and the Bolsheviks, how they acted during that revolution and after. And this is a lie, a pure lie. The text that is used to create this myth is the only longer text she wrote about the subject, called The Russian Revolution, written in 1918. And I think you have all seen inspirational quotes in nice graphic floating around on Facebook, trying to portray Luxemburg as this defender of democracy against the dictatorship of Russia and the Bolsheviks. The Luxemburgists, they try to use the article to portray Rosa Luxemburg as a defender of bourgeois parliamentarism. That's difficult to say, parliamentarism, as opposed to Soviet power. Sorry. Basically saying, as you can be a revolutionary, you can be a Marxist, you can follow Rosa Luxemburg, but within this system, within the capitalist democratic system. Yet again, this is absolutely false. This was not the ideas of Rosa Luxemburg. First of all, some facts regarding when and under what conditions the article was written. Facts that the Luxemburgists completely ignore when they use the article. They never mention these things. When the Russian Revolution broke out, it was during the First World War, and Rosa Luxemburg was in prison. She was put in prison by the German authorities for her own safety, which meant she had no sentence and no right to try to have that sentence overturned, and no time limit for when she would get out. And she was only freed by the German Revolution. I think it must have been really, really frustrating for her. Her access to information was extremely limited, and also, and I think she knew this, what information she was fed was being filtered through the German authorities. So she wasn't getting the clear picture. So she wrote down her observations for her own clarification. And she refused to publish it because she knew full well that it would be distorted by the enemies of the revolution. Frederiksen, who was a close friend of Luxemburg, stated that after Luxemburg was released from prison in November 1918, she had said that her views had been wrong and based on insufficient information. The text was only published 3 years after her death. It was published in 1922 by Paul Levy, without Luxemburg ever allowing him to do it. Well, at the time she was dead, so obviously not, but not before then either. At that time, Paul Levy had just been expelled from the German Communist Party, and it was a way of getting back at the movement. So you should think that you should take this text and use it with a bit of care. But the Luxemburgists, they don't do that. But all that being said, you cannot read the text and come to the conclusion that Luxemburg was opposed to the October Revolution or the Bolsheviks. It is only if you take quotes completely out of context and completely distort the entire article that you can portray it like this. And I dare anyone who thinks that to read the article from end to beginning. The text both begins and ends with long praises of the revolution, the Bolsheviks, and Lenin and Trotsky. I have taken one quote, but there are many, many like this throughout the article. In the beginning of the article, as far as I remember, Luxemburg wrote the following: whatever a party could offer of courage, revolutionary farsightedness, and consistency in an historic hour, Lenin, Trotsky, and all the other comrades have given in good measure. All the revolutionary honor and capacity which Western social democracy lacked was represented by the Bolsheviks. Their October uprising was not only the actual salvation of the Russian Revolution, it was also the salvation of the honor of international socialism. I think from this quote alone, it should be quite clear. And as I said, there are several quotes like this. These are not the ones that are put on inspirational graphic on Facebook. What is taken from the article is that she raised some concrete points of criticism against the Bolsheviks. But her criticism is a comradely critique of specific steps taken by the Bolsheviks, not a denunciation of the October Revolution. And mainly it was written as a warning against thinking you could take the experience from the Russian Revolution and mechanically transfer that onto, for example, Germany. And she explained that the problems facing the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks was a direct consequence of the isolation of the revolution in the backward conditions of the country. And she laid the responsibility for this on the shoulders of the German working class, and not least the leadership of the German working class. And she explained that the solution to the problems faced by the revolution and the Bolsheviks was to break the isolation of the country by carrying out the German Revolution. And the purpose of the article and the task of the German revolutionaries was to learn from the Russian experience in order to prepare for the German Revolution. So if we read the article in its entirety, instead of picking out and choosing quotes out of context in order to misrepresent her views, it's impossible to interpret Rosa Luxemburg as being against Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks. She agreed with the way the October Revolution was carried out. She agreed with what Lenin and Trotsky had to do to defend the young Soviet Republic. And as a genuine internationalist, she understood that the German Revolution had to succeed in order to save the Russian Revolution and come to their aid. And when she faced the problems of the revolution, she ended up with the same conclusions as the Bolsheviks. Because a few months after she had written this article, the German Revolution did break out. It released Rosa from prison, and from then on, she threw all she had into securing the victory of the German Revolution. And here, the problems of revolution became concrete. One of the things that she had criticized the Bolsheviks for was the disbanding of the Constituent Assembly. It's a criticism that is eagerly seized upon by those reformers who try to portray Lenin and Trotsky as undemocratic or anti-democratic or authoritarian, as against Luxemburg's democratic socialism. But what was the facts? The Bolsheviks throughout their history had supported the call for a constituent assembly, seeing this as a step forward from Tsarist despotism. But when they, at the time of its dissolution in January 1918, the Constituent Assembly, it no longer represented the Russian masses. The Russian masses, they were organizing their power in a higher form of government, the Soviets, who were based on the power of the working class. No bourgeois parliament is capable of expressing the rapidly changing views of the mass of working people in the course of a revolutionary upheaval. Quite the opposite, it becomes the force of derailing the actions of the masses into a careerist debating club to take the power out of the movement of the masses. And the Constituent Assembly in Russia was lagging behind revolutionary events. It had become a focal point of counter-revolutionary forces who worked to defend the essence of the reactionary Tsarist regime. The Constituent Assembly had come into being when its existence had been overtaken by the real revolutionary events, and this justified its dissolution by the Bolshevik government. By shutting down the Constituent Assembly, the Bolsheviks were not disbanding democracy, as it is claimed. Rather, they were defending genuine workers' democracy as represented by the Soviets. But from her prison cell, Rosa Luxemburg couldn't see this. And in her article, she asked, which is basically a question for herself, because it was a question of self-clarification. She asked, why can't the Constituent Assembly and the Soviet, why can't they exist side by side? But she answered that question herself when she faced the same situation in Germany just a few months later. In November 1918, in the German Revolution, workers' councils sprung up throughout Germany. And the leadership of the SPD, who at this time had become thoroughly reformist and pillars of support for capitalism, in the revolution, they pushed for a calling of a national assembly, which is basically the same as a constituent assembly. And it became clear for Rosa Luxemburg that this was a way for the leadership of the SPD to try to derail the revolution away from workers' councils into bourgeois democratic channels. It was part of their attempt to try and prevent a socialist revolution taking place in Germany. And now Rosa Luxemburg could see this clearly, that the two, the National Assembly, the Constituent Assembly on one side, and the workers' councils, the Soviets, they were mutually exclusive. And she called the National Assembly, and I quote, an outmoded legacy of bourgeois revolutions, an empty shell. And she said, to resort to the National Assembly today is consciously or unconsciously to turn the revolution back to the historical stage of bourgeois revolutions. Anyone advocating it is a secret agent of the bourgeoisie or an unconscious spokesman of petty bourgeois ideology. I think that says very clearly what she would have thought of all these people who try to use her to defend bourgeois democracy against the workers taking power. But these words of Rosa are totally ignored by our Luxemburgists of today. And the reason is quite clear. She is clearly calling for the abolition of bourgeois democratic National Assembly. Does this mean that Rosa Luxemburg was out to destroy democracy? Quite the contrary. Luxemburg, in exactly the same manner as Lenin and Trotsky, was defending the real institutions of workers' democracy, the workers' councils, the Soviets. And she was fighting the distraction and confusion that the National Assembly would have created for the revolution, and basically exposing it for being a tool of counter-revolution. So to conclude, or to how can you say, to try and sum up everything, if you look at the life of Rosa Luxemburg, she didn't get to fight this fight to the end. Her life was cut short. And I have sometimes been asked why I think it is that these left reformers can use Rosa Luxemburg. And I think this is why. She didn't lead a victorious revolution. She was killed. And she didn't live long enough to comment on the development taking place in Russia, and neither in the years after the revolution or during the Stalinist degeneration. And therefore, her ideas stayed a bit abstract, like her ideas on organization. And you don't have her writing anything actually for publication on the Russian Revolution, for example. And I am sure that if she had lived longer, she would have been implacably on the side of the revolution. I'm sure she would have been a staunch enemy of the Stalinist degeneration. And I think she would have been just as hated as Lenin by both the bourgeoisie and the reformists. After all, it was the reformists that had her killed. In January 1919, her life was cut short by the reactionary Freikorps soldiers. They were spurred on by the Social Democrat who led a campaign, a murderous campaign against Rosa Luxemburg and the other outstanding leader of the German Communist Party, Karl Liebknecht, and the rest of the leadership of the newly formed German Communist Party. It happened at a time when the Communist Party was only 2 weeks old. It had just been formed on the New Year's Eve of 1918, 1919. The newly formed Communist Party was left without its head, and the German Revolution was defeated, as we know. It was a catastrophe for the workers worldwide. It left the Russian Revolution isolated, and it paved the way for fascism in Germany. And I think as revolutionaries today, and Marxists today, we have to ask ourselves, could it have been otherwise? What can we learn from this? And we have to look at the difference between Germany and Russia. Why did the Russian Revolution succeed, and why was the German Revolution defeated? And of course, there are many different aspects, but I think the main and the decisive question was the existence of the Bolshevik Party in Russia and the lack of an equivalent in Germany. The Bolshevik Party was a cadre organization built over years. It was based on a solid foundation of Marxist theory and had roots in the working class. This was what Lenin had strived for and worked for since 1903. When we look at the German Revolution, when that broke out, no such cadre organization existed. The revolutionaries was in a loose network of a few thousands and only had 50 in Berlin. The Communist Party was only formed during the revolution, 2 months into the revolution. At this time, it becomes clear in retrospective that it was only Lenin who understood the need to build a revolutionary cadre organization. For many years, Luxemburg thought that the SPD would become the revolutionary party, or be the revolutionary party, and that the masses of the workers would force it to be the revolutionary party. But Lenin also, for many years, held out the SPD as a model. In hindsight, I think it's clear to see that what Rosa Luxemburg should have done was to build a revolutionary tendency long before inside the SPD. And that would have made the split between the reformists and the revolutionaries much clearer when it happened. But it is much easier to see in hindsight. We know what happened in the German and the Russian Revolution. So I think Luxemburg might be excused. But the point is, her followers are not excused. Us who live today are not excused if we don't learn from the experience. We have, on the basis of the experience of the Russian and German Revolution, we can see that Lenin was correct in realizing the need to build a cadre organization. And towards the end of her life, Luxemburg drew the same conclusion and set out to form the German Communist Party. So I think now it's time for us to reclaim the revolutionary legacy of Rosa Luxemburg and to learn from her life and her experience. And it is up to us to fulfill the task set by Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, and all the other revolutionaries that came before us, to struggle with all that we have in order to secure the victory of the socialist world revolution. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marie, for this introduction. And I really hope it makes people who have listened want to buy the book written by Marie and delve into this topic. Now we're going to move straight into the discussion period. The first speaker will be Ben Glenietsky from the British section of the IMT.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Marie for a really great introduction. So, comrades, Lenin explained that in every revolution, the most basic question is the question of state power. The bourgeois state must be smashed by the revolution and replaced with a worker state. And attempts to reform the bourgeois state or transform it into a tool of the workers are doomed to fail. And it's this that distinguishes reformists from revolutionaries. And this question formed a very important part of Rosa Luxemburg's battle against reformism, against revisionism. In her text, Reform or Revolution, she wrote, "The theory of the gradual introduction of socialism proposes progressive reform of capitalist property and the capitalist state in the direction of socialism." Bernstein, the theoretician of revisionism, of reformism, Bernstein proposes to change the sea of capitalist bitterness into a sea of socialist sweetness by pouring into it bottles of social reformist lemonade. And Rosa Luxemburg says this is a ridiculous idea, because she goes on to say, the production relations of capitalist society approach more and more towards the production relations of socialist society. And that is to say that as capitalism expands, it socializes production from individual craftsmen to production lines that span the globe, involving thousands of workers. But on the other hand, she continues, in its political and juridical relations, that is to say, the state, they establish between capitalist and socialist society a steadily rising wall. So even as capitalism socializes production on the question of the state, it establishes a wall between private and or between capitalism and socialist society. And she says this wall is not overthrown, but on the contrary, is actually strengthened by the development of social reforms and the course of democracy. Only the hammer blow of revolution, which is the conquest of political power by the proletariat, can break that wall down. Now, this is a really crucial theoretical point. Luxemburg is saying that social reforms willingly granted by a bourgeois democratic regime can actually strengthen the capitalist state as a weapon of class rule, because the illusion is created that the state acts in the interests of all classes. Of course, we are in favor of reforms, but how you win the reforms is the crucial question. We want class struggle to force the ruling class to grant those reforms, because that strengthens the working class. It strengthens the confidence of the workers in their own institutions and their own abilities, which prepares the working class for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the capitalist state. What we do not want is to debate, convince, trade favors with the bourgeois state, with diplomacy or parliamentary maneuvers and so on. This is not our method for winning reforms, because it demobilizes the working class and it builds illusions in the capitalist state, and it throws back the struggle for revolution. Now, Luxemburg took this up theoretically against Bernstein, but also concretely against Millerand and some of the French social democrats. Millerand was a socialist politician who joined a bourgeois government in France. He aimed to secure gains for the working class, yes, but not through class struggle, but through deals and diplomacy and parliamentary cretinism. Now, the result of that was that instead of Millerand reforming the bourgeois government and making the bourgeois government a bit more socialist, the French bourgeoisie used Millerand as a left cover for their reactionary policies. They made him a bit more capitalist. Now, Luxemburg fought very hard against Millerandism. She wrote the following: the entry of a socialist into a bourgeois government is not a partial conquest of the bourgeois state by socialists, but a partial conquest of the Socialist Party by the bourgeois state. Marie explained how the question of state power was posed very sharply by the Russian Revolution. And Marie explained how Luxemburg was initially inconsistent in applying her own ideas to this concrete situation. She recognized the supreme importance of the Soviets as the basis for a new workers' state, but at the same time, she argued that a constituent assembly, a bourgeois parliament, should also be convened, because she said it could be pushed to the left by the masses. And this is a middle position, which tries to combine the smashing of the bourgeois state machine with reforming it, with pushing it to the left. But this, as Maria explained, this was corrected by Luxemburg during the revolution in Germany. The same question of the state was posed point blank. Should there be a state based on the workers' councils, or should it be based on a bourgeois democratic national assembly? And Luxemburg's position could not have been clearer. She wrote, "No evasions, no ambiguities. The die must be cast. Yesterday, parliamentary cretinism was a weakness. Today, it is an ambiguity. Tomorrow, it will be a betrayal of socialism." In other words, any illusions in bourgeois democracy were condemned by Luxemburg as a betrayal of socialism. These were the revolutionary ideas of Rosa Luxemburg on the state. If we can steel ourselves in these ideas, then the workers' state that we will build in the future will be her legacy. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was an excellent contribution. So it's been pointed out in Mary's introduction that one of the main lessons of the life of Rosa Luxemburg is the need to build a strong revolutionary party in advance of revolutions. And this is what the IMT is trying to do, incorporating these lessons into our work today. But to build such an organization, we have the ideas, but we need the money also to put these ideas to the workers and youth. So if you're enthused by what you've heard so far, I would strongly urge you to make a donation to the IMT. Every penny goes a long way into helping us building the Revolutionary Party all across the world. To do so, you can go to donate.marxist.com. Next up, we'll have Stamatis from the Greek section of the IMT.
Rosa Luxemburg, in addition to her important general contribution to Marxist theory, was particularly distinguished in the important theoretical and political cause of Marxism's polemic against reformism. And it will not be an exaggeration to say that Rosa and the founder of the Russian Marxism, Georgy Plekhanov, produced the most systematic and complete responses to reformism's most prominent theorist, Edward Bernstein. Bernstein, from 1896 to 1898, in his articles in the German Social Democratic journal Neue Zeit, and in his book, The Conditions of Socialism, had put forward the idea that socialists should emancipate themselves from outdated phraseology, meaning the revolutionary ideas, and become the party of reforms. Bernstein's revisionist theory raised the question of the true relationship between reform and revolution. According to Bernstein and his followers in the German social democracy, the constant pursuit of legitimate reforms can lead gradually and without the need for revolution to socialism. Rosa's response came with a series of articles and documents in 1898 and 1899 that make up her work, Reform and Revolution. And this was the beginning of Rosa's 5-year theoretical struggle against Bernstein conceptions with various documents. Rosa, in her answer to the general question of the relationship between reform and revolution, while defending as an orthodox Marxist the revolutionary road to socialism, does not renounce, as the frivolous ultra-left sectarians might consider, reforms in general. She explained that revolution and reform are not two different methods of historical progress that someone can choose from the buffet of history, but they are different moments in the evolution of class society. In history, she explained, progressive reforms are, as a rule, the product of revolutions. She pointed out that whoever, in the name of struggle for democracy, chooses reform as a substitute and opposite element to revolution, does not choose a peaceful path for the same purpose, but in fact chooses another purpose. Instead of worker power and socialism, he or she chooses capitalism and one of the political forms of bourgeoisie's rule, bourgeois democracy. So Rosa was not at all against reforms, but in the struggle for reforms, she saw the means of preparing, organizing, and educating the working class for the seizure of power. Of particular value in her work, Reform or Revolution, is the Marxist critique of Bernstein's ideas on the questions of the capitalist economy and the character and the role of labor unions. Because according to Bernstein, who arbitrarily generalized a phase where capitalism was developing, and could in Western Europe make concessions of a few crowns to the working class, of course, from the table of robbery of the colonies. According to Bernstein, capitalism is capable of adaptation, and its economic crises are now light and momentary fluctuations. He argued that the contradictions of capitalism are no longer acute, and this makes socialism no longer objectively necessary. And so socialism cannot be founded scientifically, but only morally, and it returns to the state it was before Marx, an utopia. According to Bernstein, the means to overcome this contradiction is, on the one hand, the development of credit, and on the other hand, the development of trusts and cartels. In relation to credit, Rosa replied that it does not prevent the crisis from occurring, but instead makes it more acute when it occurs. In periods of capitalist prosperity, credit increases the possibilities of expansion of production, but it does not deal with the basic contradiction that produced the crisis, and that is the contradiction between the expansionary tendency of production and the private property of the means of production. Because as soon as the first symptoms of recession appear, credit falls and stops expanding just when the system needs it. In this way, it worsened the crisis. And in relation to cartels and trusts, Rosa explained that it may appear that at the national market level, these monopolies eliminate competition, but because the global market is imposed on all states, cartels and trusts in international level make the competition much sharper. So do not soften, but sharpen the contradiction of the system. Finally, reflecting the illusions created at this period by the increasing power of the trade unions in Germany, Bernstein wrote in his book that the struggle of the trade unions would gradually reduce profits so much that surplus value would eventually disappear, and exploitation itself will be abolished. But according to Rosa, unions, by demanding higher wages for better purchasing power, of course, they do not abolish surplus value and exploitation. And she explained that trade union struggle is like the work of Sisyphus, who was condemned by Zeus to carry on his back a large rock up a mountain, which was falling from the mountain, and the process of transportation started again and again. And that's why the bureaucrats of the German unions declare Rosa as enemy of the trade union. They argued that unions would gradually gain power in big enterprises, firstly together with the employers and then without them. But for Rosa, the co-management of trade unions and bosses in big business with joint price fixing would constitute an employer-labor cartel at the expense of the entire working class, but also a blow against the militancy of the labor movement.
Thank you very much, Stamatis, for this excellent contribution. So before we move on to the next contribution, I want to strongly encourage everyone listening to check our theoretical magazine. Our theoretical magazine, In Defense of Marxism, comes out every 3 months. It contains exclusive articles on various aspects of Marxist theory and history. The issue of this summer contains an article on the American Civil War, which is a fascinating topic that all Marxists should learn about. And at a time where inflation is ravaging the savings of working class people, we also have a theoretical article on Marxism, money, and inflation. So I strongly recommend you go to our website and take a subscription to In Defense of Marxism. The magazine is also available in German, in Russian, and in Swedish, as well as a Spanish version called America Socialista. So get your subscription today. Now the next speaker will be Comrade Oscar from the Swedish section of the IMT.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, comrades. I would just like to give one example of how the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg is being distorted. I think in general, the enemies of Marxism have two main ways of discouraging radical people from revolutionary politics. The first way is what was done with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, for example. It's to attack the image of the leaders of Marxism ruthlessly. They make Lenin out to be a bloodthirsty dictator responsible for the death of millions, and they equate Bolshevism with Stalinism. Of course, none of this is true, we know that, but it serves the purpose of alienating people from genuine Marxism. The second way is to transform the person in question into a harmless symbol, a person who doesn't stand for anything that can really harm the capitalist system. And I think this second example is what was done with Rosa Luxemburg. The reformists, the feminists, the anarchists, they have time and time again distorted her views through quoting out of context and misunderstanding what she actually wrote. Consciously or not, they have often ended up portraying her views as being the opposite of what they actually were. I actually recently read an article which was published in the American left-wing magazine Jacobin, where this is the case. It was published last year, and I think it's a good example of how this distortion is usually done. The article was actually called The Revolutionary Legacy of Rosa Luxemburg. So sounds good, but ironically, the whole point of the article seems to be to argue that she tried to combine reformism and revolutionary politics. You see, what they did first is that it distorts the question of the fight for actual reforms in general and the ideology of reformism. And they make it out to seem as if us revolutionaries are against the reforms themselves and not the ideology of reformism. And then they say, and I'm going to quote from the article now, when Luxemburg criticized Bernstein, her main point of dissatisfaction was that Bernstein was committed to dismantling the very ideal of socialism as access to political power. It's not a question of saying that Luxemburg is a revolutionary and not a reformist. It's rather a question of seeing what purpose reform should serve. That's the end of the quote. So in other words, they are saying that we shouldn't bother with this question of reformism or revolution, and that they can actually be combined. They literally say that reform and revolution weren't different ways of doing things. And obviously, this is a great argument if you want to keep the question of how the workers can actually take power away from the discussion. But for a Marxist, the question of reformism or revolution is not something that can just be brushed away so easily. It's a crucial question. We will obviously always fight for reforms, but you can't reform capitalism into socialism. That's what we believe. And Rosa Luxemburg, she fought against reformism her whole life, as the comrades have explained, and she gave her life in the struggle for a socialist revolution, which is what makes it especially scandalous that reformists and opportunists of all kinds try to use these quotes out of context to make it seem as if she stood for something that is the opposite of what she actually fought for. And this article, it also claims that she was against the organizing of a party along the lines of the Bolsheviks. And even though the author admits that she defended the Russian Revolution of 1917, They used the debates she had with Lenin about the party and the role of the masses to present it as if Bolshevism automatically led to Stalinism. And in the end of the article, they do their best, but they struggle to present this new Luxemburgism, so to speak, which is supposed to be a continuation or a development of Marxism, but whose most prominent feature is to combine reformism and revolution. So in the end, we are left with Rosa Luxemburg as a harmless thinker who develops her own Marxism, and with the help of half-truth, distortions, and lies. This is presented in contradiction to the so-called dictatorship of Lenin. And the aim of all of this is to stop all of those people who come into contact with things such as revolutions, Marxism, Luxemburg, and Lenin. It's to stop them from drawing the conclusions that should flow from reading about the life and the work of Lenin and Luxemburg. So I think it's time that we drag the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg out of the dirt so that we can truly learn from her life and struggle and prepare a victory for our class in the future. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Oscar. So the last speaker today will be Fred Weston from the International Secretariat of the IMT. And then we'll have Marie give her concluding remarks to the discussion.
Okay, well, it's been a very good discussion, an excellent lead off by Marie. And it was long overdue, I think, a book by ourselves on Rosa Luxemburg. For decades now, I've had Rosa Luxemburg in the background as this person that you had to explain a lot about, because she would always come up in the movement as a figure, as comrades have explained, an alternative to Leninism. In the 1970s in Italy, I remember she was very fashionable. Whenever anybody used Rosa Luxemburg, it was never to bring out the revolutionary side of her. It was always about everything else but her revolutionary ideas. And it was, I remember she was quite popular in the left wing of the Italian Socialist Party in the 1970s, because you had a phenomenon then, which you could describe it as a kind of centrism that emerged. This sudden lurch to the left in words, in moments of class struggle, like in the 1970s. Centrism is a phenomenon that appears in moments of acute class struggle. And these socialist leaders trying to give themselves a left image as they move to the left under the pressure found in Rosa Luxemburg a useful tool. But I was looking through some of her letters, and it's clear that Rosa Luxemburg realized long before Lenin how far the leaders of the SPD had degenerated. She was very close to the Kautsky and his wife. But, in Easter 1908, she went on a trip with Kautsky to Lake Geneva. And it was in this trip that she started to lose the illusions that she had had. She could see the personality of this friend that she had. She realized for the first time that she found him boring, monotonous, with no imagination, and heavy going, and he was heavy to listen to. And she realized then that her long-held friendship was now in decline. It was from then that she expressed in her letters that she found the Sunday dinners at the Kautskys, she found them boring. And then she said, soon, this is in one of her letters, 27th of June, 1908, soon I will not be able to read one line of Kautsky. It's like a disgusting mass of cobwebs from which you can free yourself only by a mental bath of Marx. So she had begun to see the limitations. And in fact, she expressed the position she found herself in a letter to Clara Zetkin in 1907. This is what she wrote. I feel quite isolated. August, she's referring here to Bebel, August Bebel, and the others have gone over completely to parliamentarism. So she explains that the left used her, the official left, that is August Bebel. In reality, he was the center of the party. He used Rosa Luxemburg against Bernstein, but then this is what she says in her letter. When it comes to launching an offensive against opportunism, the older leaders always side with Eddie. Eddie is Bernstein, actually. Volmar and David. Basically, she's saying, when it comes down to the real battle, they're always on the other side. And this is the dilemma she found herself in for years, actually, inside the party. Now, she finally came to the correct conclusions. Before dying, she understood the need to build the Communist Party. The myth they present of her as being anti-Leninist doesn't stand up to the test, because she was building a party which was a section of the Communist International led by Lenin. What the so-called Luxemburgists really express when they use Luxemburg is that they reject the discipline of a revolutionary party. They reject its centralism to its revolutionary essence. Now, Marie explained, she compared, Lenin's 20-year battle for the Bolshevik Party. And eventually, of course, the Bolshevik Party emerged after years of being a faction together with the Mensheviks into an independent force. But it took years to achieve that. Now, sometimes I find a stupid polemic on the left about what should Rosa have done. She should have split a long time before. That's not the point. Point is, she should have organized a faction like the Bolshevik Party. That's what she should have done inside the party, and prepare the ground for what Lenin eventually achieved. Something else that Rosa did realize that is not highlighted, she realized the difficulties that the Bolsheviks faced once they came to power. And she did not criticize them for taking power. That's the false picture that they present. She understood the problems faced by the revolution in isolation. And she says this very, very clearly. She also puts the blame for this isolation on the leaders of the SPD in Germany, because by not carrying out the revolution in Germany, they contributed directly to the isolation of the Russian Revolution. And see how important this was for Lenin. In March 1918, in a speech, Lenin said this: "It is the absolute truth that without a German revolution, we are doomed." This was the clarity of Lenin on the need for the German Revolution. Now, we're discussing history here. It's easy to see the mistakes after 100 years. But imagine if the German Revolution had succeeded. Imagine the effect that would have had across the whole of Europe. The Russian Revolution was not an isolated revolution, in the sense it wasn't just one revolution. There was a revolution in many countries. There was the German Revolution 1918, Hungary 1919, Italy 1920. A few years later, you had China in 1926, and the big general strike in Britain in the same year, 1926. And then, of course, the revolutionary events in Spain and France in the 1930s. And then, of course, even when the Communist Party was created in Germany, it was infantile, inexperienced, and suffered also from ultra-leftism. And this affected many of the communist parties in Europe. So a discussion on Rosa Luxemburg is about what? We take the best of Rosa, we underline that she was a revolutionary, but we also don't look with, we look at it with open eyes. We also see the mistakes, but they were genuine mistakes of a genuine revolutionary. She was also capable of learning from her mistakes, which she did many times. But as Marie said, she was weak on particularly the question of organization. So what monument can we build to Rosa Luxemburg? Well, first of all, build a genuine Bolshevik organization in Germany, which we are doing, we are beginning to do, and also do it on a global scale. And remember, we have to be prepared long before the events. That's the difference between the experience of Bolshevism in Russia and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany. When the revolution broke out, the Germans were not ready. They were not ready both theoretically and organizationally. This school is about educating our comrades in theory to avoid repeating those mistakes, and then build an organization to take those ideas into the movement.
Thank you very much for that, Fred. And thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion. That was excellent. So now I will turn it back to Marie for the conclusion.
Thank you, Julian. And thank you to all who contributed in the discussion. I think it has been marvelous. Some really good contributions. First of all, I want to say that this discussion has been, and my lead-off was very limited in scope. There are many questions that I didn't touch upon. This talk focused on these two main myths that has been created by all those, like the Jacobin magazine and people like that, who tries to take Luxembourg and use it for their own purpose. But there are many other questions. Of course, she lived a long, well, not long life, but until she was 47. There was many questions she touched upon, and things where I think she was correct and things where I think she was wrong. But I think it's essential to take the essence of her life and her legacy. And I think mistakes she made and all she did from the perspective of fighting for revolution. And because she had an unwavering faith in the working class and their ability to take power. In opposition to most of those who try to use her, who has no faith in the working class, but calls themselves Marxist anyway. I think Luxemburg was a Marxist in the true Marxist sense, if you can say that. There are many so-called Marxists today, academic Marxists, who use the method and analysis of Marx and find them interesting to look at different aspects of society today. But Marx said it very clearly himself. I don't have the quote here, so it's from memory. But he said something like, "It was not up to me to invent the notion of class struggle." And if you look at society today, there are many who accept the notion of class struggle also in the bourgeoisie. That doesn't make you a Marxist to talk about class struggle and the existence of classes. No, Marx said his contribution, and his and Engels' contribution, was the realization that the workers could not take, as Ben pointed out, could not take the bourgeois state and use it for its own purposes. That the workers had to smash the bourgeois state and create a new state, a worker state. And this is what Rosa Luxemburg fought for. And I think it's worth quoting Lenin when it comes to Luxembourg. He wrote an article in, I don't remember when, 1919 maybe, where he lists some points where he thought Rosa Luxemburg was wrong, like the national question, a question that they never agreed on. But first of all, he says, he wrote in Left-Wing Communism, he says, what applies to individuals also applies with necessary modifications to politics and parties. It is not he who makes no mistakes that is intelligent. There are no such men, nor can there be. It is he whose errors are not very grave and who is able to rectify them easily and quickly that is intelligent. This is, he said in general, it was not related to Luxembourg. But in relation to Luxembourg, he used a Russian proverb to describe her after her death. And he said, eagles may at times fly lower than hens, but hens can never rise to the height of an eagle. In spite of her mistakes, she was and remained for us an eagle. This is Lenin's appraisal of Rosa Luxemburg. So when we say we want to reclaim the legacy of Luxemburg, it is not down to every dot and comma she ever wrote. She is being used to try and derail young people who are getting radicalized away from revolutionary ideas. And these people belong to revolutionary Marxism and not to some left reformism. The young people who are looking for revolutionary ideas, they belong in the IMT. And that is why we're trying to save the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg. And I wanted to give another quote. I apologize to the translators. Because I think also what Fred pointed out, what is the purpose of this school we are having now? And what was the purpose of Rosa Luxemburg in her life? And what is always forgotten by these left reformists, or not forgotten, but hidden? They ridicule the fact that we are orthodox Marxists, that we focus on theory. And this is what Rosa Luxemburg had to say about theory and the need for theory. She says, what appears to characterize the practice that is reformism above all? A certain hostility to theory. This is quite natural. For our theory, that is the principles of scientific socialism, impose clearly marked limitations to practical activity, insofar as it concerns the aims of this activity, the means used in attaining these aims, and the method employed in this activity. It is quite natural for people who run after immediate practical results to want to free themselves from such limitations and to render their practice independent of our theory. I think this is quite an excellent reply to all those reformists that you can meet in Overflow today also, who try to dismiss theory as something unnecessary, but also to the other side of the coin, those who are Marxist in the academic scholastic way, where you just sit and discuss and you take no practical consequences and organize. For Luxemburg and for us, theory is a guide to action. That is why we study, and that is why we have discussions like these. And what she did, and I think Fred explained this very well in this debate in the German SPD, and I think this is one of her strongest points, the debate against Bernstein and revisionism. She took the discussion head on, where the leaders of the SPD, they tried to avoid, this is a question of nuance, this is not important for the practical questions right now, and so on. And one of the leaders actually said to Bernstein, dear friend, we don't usually go around saying these things, we just do them. We don't throw ourselves into theoretical debates about revolution, we just continue with our reformist practice. And I think that is the situation in most working class organizations today. And as has been explained very well by several contributions, the question of reform and revolution is not a question of us or Luxembourg being against reforms. It is against the idea that capitalism can be reformed to a capitalism with a human face. And I think this is also why this is not a historical question, the legacy of Rosa Luxemburg. These questions that she touched upon are the burning questions of today. She's famous for saying socialism or barbarism. I think that was actually quoting Engels, but she has become famous for this, that the fate of which humanity is facing is socialism or barbarism. And I think that is very clear today when it comes to wars, to climate change, to hunger, to the economy. And I think this is the main question for us. Why are we revolutionaries? If we look at history since the beginning of the workers' movement, since the time of Rosa Luxemburg, it is very clear that all attempts to create this capitalism with a human face, the basic idea of reformism, of the revision of Marxism that Bernstein put forward, is that we slowly, reform by reform, can create a better capitalism. And that maybe sometime that will automatically turn into socialism. but that is not the important question. And I would say if that was true, that we bit by bit could make lives better for the great majority of humanity, I might be a reformist. But the problem is that is not how reality is. Life is not getting better for the big majority bit by bit. It was an historical exception, the time of the post-war boom, a period where semi-civilized conditions could be created for some part of the working class in some part of the world. This is not how it is today. Capitalism finds itself in a blind alley, and it cannot create a better life for the great majority of the population. And it cannot solve the burning questions that is in front of humanity. So the fact now is that we're not bit by bit going towards a better future, quite the opposite. All that was won in the past is now being taken back. So this discussion that was, I don't know if it was started, but between Bernstein and Luxemburg and other revolutionaries, the question of reform or revolution is just as valid today as it was back then. And you see the exact same arguments being put forward today. As I remember, the finance minister of the Greek Syriza government, Varoufakis, at the time of the referendum and the fight against the European Central Bank imposing cuts and austerity towards the Greek workers, he said something like, now is not the time to talk about socialism. First, we have to create a better capitalism, and then we can talk about socialism. And there are arguments like this all over the left wing. But the point is, we cannot create a better capitalism. And therefore, the only way forward is to fight for a socialist overthrow of this system. And to take this from Rosa Luxemburg, her faith in the working class to move, and also their ability to change society, but also to learn from her in the negative sense, you could say, the need to beforehand, before the revolution, to build a strong revolutionary cadre organization capable of securing the victory of the working class. And I think that task is up to us.